In this video, I show you some of my terrain backlog and how I get through it, and how you can too. I love building and painting miniatures so I can play all kinds of war games with them. It's kind of my thing. However, I recently discovered that I love building and painting terrain for wargaming just as much, if not maybe a little bit more. Your terrain completely makes or breaks your wargaming table, and good terrain will elevate a game from kind of fun to memorable. And that's part of what we do as wargamers, try to build fun memories with the games that we play. One of the most enjoyable things for me in terrain is making stuff that can be used in multiple games. Now, admittedly, like sci-fi spaceports rarely fit in fantasy skirmish games, and 28mm scale buildings look real weird in Battletech. But besides the big differences in genre and scale, making a piece that can visually fit, for example, like in Warhammer 40K, Space Weirdos, 5 Parsecs from Home, Planet 28, and other sci-fi wargames makes a lot of sense. It's the ultimate double dip to make one terrain piece for multiple games. So, fitting within the idea of multi-purpose terrain, I recently decided to finally build a project that's been rattling around in my head for some time now, literally years. I was inspired by these PVC downspout elbow connector things that I saw at the hardware store, and I bought a few to use for cool sci-fi vents, for like a massive underground facility. All those people in the underground facilities that you see in the movies and stuff, they gotta breathe, right? So the downspout, when turned technically upside down, kind of looks like a giant vent in 28mm scale, and all it needed was a base and, some embellishments and stuff like that. What finally got me moving was VinciCon, where I hung out at Vince Venturella's house with the likes of, Vince, of course, it's his house, and Sam Lenz, Ninjon, Miniac, and Ben Cantor. They all painted pretty much nonstop for the 4 days we were there, but I was trying to learn to 3D model on the computer. Somewhat. I knew I wanted this vent to sit on a base, which I assumed I was probably going to end up cutting out of MDF or something like that. But it would be hard to cut it straight without a table saw or something like that, and I don't have a table saw. And then I'd have to sort of sci-fi it up as well and put extra greeblies and bits and stuff like that on it. Or I could just 3D print the base with my new FDM 3D printer, so I designed a base. After VinciCon, I got home and I printed out the base. It worked great first try. I used a program called Tinkercad to design it. Tinkercad actually runs in a browser, so anybody can use it, and it's free as well. And it was actually pretty easy. But then I decided that my vent needed some kind of grate over the opening so that, people don't fall in, I suppose. I don't know. That's going to be a lot more of a difficult and complex shape than the base was. So I had to move over to a different 3D modeling application called Plasticity 3D, which I just recently bought and have been kind of very slowly learning. I measured the width and the length of the opening, but then there were the rounded corners. I kind of eyeballed the straight portion of each of the sides before the curve of the corners, and then measured how long I kind of thought those straight parts were. It's not super accurate. And then I made the corner radii to kind of fit within that shape in the software. Then I added the actual vent parts, the little slats and all that kind of stuff. It was all, frankly, an educated guess, and I assumed, as the part was, printing on my printer, that I'd either have to, sand it down a bunch to get it to fit into the hole, which was honestly probably the best case scenario, or there'd be big gaps in the corners because the radius was either too tight, probably too tight, and I'd either have to, either fill them in with some sort of filler or print them again and redo the whole thing. But instead, I got it right. First try. This is a very satisfying thing and has already inspired new 3D printed designs in my head. I also like to mix in other sort of store-bought parts into my terrain builds. It makes them look a little bit more legitimate. I bought this resin piece with a bunch of crates and barrels from a booth at Gen Con or Adepticon, not actually from Crate and Barrel. I wanted them to be sitting under the overhang of the vent to keep them out of the rain. In sci-fi dystopian settings, which are generally my favorite kinds of settings, it always seems to be raining. So you got to keep these things in mind. I used then afterwards textured paint to sort of grunge up around the edges and sort of hide the joins where the vent meets the base. And then it was time to prime. Prime time. If you live in a part of the world that has winter, I mean, technically all the parts of the world have winter, right? But I'm talking about the cold and snowy kind, then you probably know the pain. Rushing outside on what is probably the last nice day of autumn to rattle can spray prime a whole bunch of projects, especially terrain, so that you can work on them over the long winter. Now, since I have an airbrush, I don't usually rattle can prime figures anymore, but I used to, right? I still do use rattle can for terrain projects, though. Generally, terrain takes a lot more abuse than your figures do, so a good primer from a can will help protect your paint jobs on your terrain over the long haul. I sprayed this vent project thingy with dark brown primer to give it a kind of a warm undercoat, right? So that it kind of looks like rusty in little spots here and there if it doesn't get completely covered. And I left it in the garage overnight to dry and to outgas the propellant, which is generally the smelly part of the rattle can process. The next day was going to be great rattle can weather as well, so I could spray more stuff if I had stuff to spray. I did have some other 3D printed fantasy terrain that I had bought at Adepticon, and I thought I could maybe spray that as well and just get another little thing ready to go for winter, right? But life and also kind of bad CA glue that wouldn't set properly got in the way, and I wasn't able to construct it like I wanted to so that I could spray it, and I was sort of bummed. When I went to check on the sci-fi vent the next day to bring it inside and start painting it, I figured I should probably bring in some of the other projects that I had primed when the weather was nice. They were all still sitting outside in the garage as well. At this point, I didn't feel as bad about not being able to rattle can that last piece for the winter, as I realized that I had a big fantasy house, which I had bought, and a ruined necromancer's tower, which I had 3D printed, a cool cyberpunk sushi shop, another fantasy house, and some rock formations, a bunch of shipping containers from Monster Fight Club, my first 2 Zone Mortalis tiles, and 10 plastic kind of sidewalk-style tiles from Elric's Hobbies that had been sitting in the garage long enough that squirrels, or maybe even raccoons, had walked on them. And that didn't even include a few pieces I already had brought in earlier in the summer, and they were down in the basement. It turns out there was more than I thought. So in the face of all of this choice, I decided to get the project at hand finished. I taped off the base and focused on painting the body of the vent. I wanted to use a color that wasn't just another variation of gray, so I used Majestic Fortress air paint from the Army Painter. Spraying kind of a thin coat of it over the brown primer gave the vent a worn look, almost two-tone a little bit, which, of course, is what I wanted in this terrain piece. Then it was time to paint the base, and I wanted that to actually be gray, mainly because it's the base. I taped off the vent and then sprayed Regiment Gray from the Army Painter heavily over the brown primer, trying to cover up most of it so it would be different than with the body where I had some of the brown still showing through, right? I used my cheap kind of yard sale hair dryer, only $2, to speed up the dry time like I usually do, and then I used some Raven Black on the vent parts, but mainly just kind of in the middle. I wanted the edges of the vents where they kind of go into the sides of the overall body of the thing to stay kind of browned and like rusty, right? Then it was time to start grunging things up, which is honestly my favorite part. Brown speed paints from the Army Painter shot through the airbrush are one of the tricks to making your terrain look like weather-worn and old. They're transparent, so they won't completely cover the color that you spray them over, but they will effectively kind of shade them a bit darker and make them look a little dirtier due to the brown tone. I started with Sand Golem, which is where I usually start. It's kind of my go-to. It can kind of look a little bit like dirt and a little bit like rust as well. I sprayed it around the textured areas where the vent meets the base, and I also used it to weather the vent as well. Then I kind of fumbled my way through making a big graffiti piece on the back of the vent. I live on the wrong side of the tracks, and I end up waiting for trains a lot when I'm trying to get places. And I see some kind of amazing graffiti go by on the train cars, some of it like really huge. I designed this imaginary gang tag and kind of cut a stencil into Frisket film and then, used it to help spray onto the vent in multiple parts. First, the very dark black, or very close to dark black, gray. It's raven black, I think is what it's called. And then I used white over that for the letters. It mostly worked, but it was a bit more fiddly than I had anticipated, mainly due to the curves of the vent and trying to get the stencil to, stick in multiple directions that way. I used some then pre-made stencils I had laying around that I'd bought from Death Ray Designs as well. After I got done weathering the big graffiti piece and kind of other parts of the vent with some Pallid Bone speed paint, which is a lighter shade of brown, it was then time to bring the piece back to the hobby table and do some regular brush work. Most of this footage kind of looks like trash because the camera setup that I'm using here is the one that I use for Twitch when I'm painting, regular size 28mm scale models, miniatures, if you will, and not for painting a 6" by 7" by 5 inches high terrain piece, right? But I can kind of give you the gist of what I did and tell you about some of the winning techniques. For one thing, ruddy fur speed paint from the Army Painter, when dabbed on kind of lightly with a bit of torn foam or sponge, makes for great looking corrosion effects. Again, it's transparent, so it doesn't cover the color underneath, it just sort of shades it, and since it's ruddy, I guess, like it says on the tin, that means it's got a little bit of kind of a reddish in it, right? It works great. So does fresh rust. Either just sponge it on straight for really bright rust spots, or like I did, kind of water it down a little bit to be a little bit more subtle and put it on some edges and some other spots and places like that. Remember, you want variation on your speckles that you're putting onto your terrain or your vehicle or whatever. You don't just want to use one color. Lastly, I found these Sharpie Creative markers with a brush tip at some office supply store, and they're actually really great for graffiti on your terrain because they dry very, very matte finish. They don't look glossy at all when they're done. Now, the package does say water-based acrylic, so they're not like oil-based paint or something like that, I guess. I just know I can't, write graffiti with a regular brush, like a normal paintbrush, to save my life. So using these brush pens for the task is actually really great. I have some water slide decals of graffiti from Death Ray Designs as well, but I kind of ran out of time for this, getting the terrain done for this video. So maybe I'll try adding them on this piece later on. So that's pretty much it. Another piece done. After I brought it in from the garage, after priming it and all that stuff, letting it outgas overnight, it was pretty much just a kind of afternoon into early evening project to get it all painted. Airbrush, as always, and then of course the sponge effects, do much of the heavy lifting here in this process. And the big graffiti piece, although it was kind of a hassle getting the stencil all right. I don't know how those folks paint those big pieces on the train cars, especially as they're moving by so quickly. As always, I learn things that I can and will use in the next piece that I do, so I see it as a mission accomplished. The moral of the story is this. It's fine to prepare for a long winter, or whatever you have in your neck of the woods, and to get things ready, right? But also make sure to finally pick a terrain piece from your prepped stuff and get it painted to completion so you can actually feel like you're finishing things rather than just prepping more and never getting anything on the tabletop. Completing a terrain piece and using it in a game can be the biggest inspiration for you to get even more terrain pieces done. And it's fun, too. Do you keep prepping terrain but never actually finishing it? Is your gaming table covered in primed buildings and rock formations? What gets you into finishing mode and not just prep mode for your terrain? Put all of your tips and questions for us down in the comments below so everybody can read them. While you're down there, check out my 5% discount code for the Army Painter in the description below. And also, hit like if you want to help spread the word about this video, and hit subscribe to see videos like this every single Friday. It's free. Thanks for watching.